A millionaire let a beggar live in his house with her daughter. The next morning, he saw her looking at the painting of her loved one who died 19 years ago. The mansion stood grandly atop the hill, a place of elegance and wealth visible for miles, yet it was nearly as desolate as the heart of its owner. Arthur Beaumont was a millionaire, a man who had everything yet held onto nothing that truly mattered. His days stretched on in silence, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the main hall, a sound that filled the vast emptiness of his house. Arthur was a tall man with silver hair and piercing, tired eyes. His well-tailored suits were immaculate, his stride calculated, his gaze cold and distant. People whispered about his wealth, but rarely spoke of him with warmth. He had acquired his fortune through years of sharp business moves, his empire built on ambition and strategy. But in this silent chapter of his life, Arthur's achievements felt like hollow accolades displayed on shelves he never looked at. He had come to this sprawling mansion not to enjoy it but to escape the world, for every room here was his refuge and his prison. 19 years ago, he had known a different life, one where his heart had been full of love. That love, now lost, lingered in every corner of his memory. The woman he'd once adored had passed away unexpectedly, and since then, Arthur had ceased to love anyone or anything. He closed off his heart, constructing walls thicker than those of his mansion, walls that kept him isolated even as the world went on around him. He could still remember her laugh and the way she used to look at him, as if he were the only person who mattered. It was this memory that haunted him the most. Though time had blurred the specifics, the ache of her absence had grown more profound, digging into his soul, shaping him into the cold man he had become. Those memories would find him in his quietest moments, striking him with a pain as fresh as the day she left. The townspeople below might envy his wealth, but they didn't understand his solitude. To them, he was a powerful, enigmatic figure, an untouchable being who was best left undisturbed. They didn't know that inside this fortress of luxury lived a man so deeply scarred that he had forgotten how to live. Now, every night, as the mansion stood shadowed against the evening sky, he roamed its hallways alone. Alone, yet not entirely so. For even in the dead of night, he felt her presence with him. The ghost of his lost love lingered in his heart and mind, reminding him of the happiness he'd once known and the emptiness he now lived with. Arthur's mansion was a place of exquisite design and chilling silence, its rooms adorned with rare artworks and furnishings from around the world. Italian marble lined the floors, the chandeliers hung with crystal that cast delicate patterns on the walls, and each room displayed ornate carvings and tapestries that whispered of untold wealth. Yet, despite its splendor, the house felt cold, more museum than home. Each carefully curated artifact seemed misplaced, as though longing for a livelier setting than the still, airless halls. The servants, few as they were, kept to their duties quietly, knowing their employer preferred silence over any small attempts at cheer or familiarity. Arthur rarely spoke to them, and they had long since stopped expecting greetings or acknowledgement. He was courteous but distant, his presence felt as a cold draft that made them uneasy, as if even a single misstep might break the unspoken rules of his solitude. At night, the mansion was dimly lit, with only a few golden lamps casting feeble circles of light down the hallways. Most of the time, Arthur chose to stay in his private quarters or his study, which looked out over the darkened valley below. From his vantage point, he could see the distant, faintly glowing lights of the town, lives he'd distanced himself from, a society he no longer participated in. He told himself he didn't care, that the isolation was his choice. But the truth was, he feared how deeply he'd allowed loneliness to root itself within him, and what might happen if he ever attempted to pull it out. The stillness in his mansion seemed to pulse, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his sadness and were now mirroring it back to him. The ticking of the grandfather clock was a constant reminder of time slipping away, each minute bringing him closer to what? More silence. Another sleepless night. The tick-tock echoed in the vast, empty rooms, filling the silence with a rhythm that felt almost mocking, as if the house itself were taunting him for the life he'd chosen. Arthur wandered the halls, staring at paintings and objects he had collected over the years. Some were bold and vivid, pieces meant to inspire joy, and others were serene landscapes meant to evoke calm. But all of them were lifeless here, like characters from a forgotten play. Even the grand piano in the sitting room, once a symbol of refined culture, sat untouched, its keys gathering dust beneath a closed lid. Sometimes, he thought about opening it, playing a piece he had once known. But each time he raised his hand to lift the cover, something within him hesitated, and he turned away. At the heart of the mansion lay the ballroom, its gleaming floor so pristine it reflected the chandeliers above. The room was designed to host gatherings, to be alive with laughter and music, but now it remained silent. Arthur had not hosted a single event since moving in. This mansion, with all its space, beauty, and elegance, was a reflection of his heart, a grand structure, frozen in time, devoid of warmth. As he continued to roam from room to room, Arthur couldn't help but feel the weight of all he had built, the wealth, the property, the things he thought would sustain him. But they had become mere relics of a life he once believed he could create. Now they felt like prison bars, trapping him within his own choices, each opulent object a reminder of his own hollowness. One room in the mansion was unlike the others. Tucked away at the end of a quiet corridor, it remained locked most of the time, a private sanctuary that only Arthur had access to. He called it the Remembrance Room. Inside, everything was as it had been 19 years ago. This room was his shrine to her, untouched by the years and meticulously preserved. Arthur entered slowly, letting the familiar scent of lavender and rose oil, her favorites, wash over him. He kept the fragrance alive here, a delicate veil that mingled with the air and brought her presence closer, almost tangible. The room was simple but elegant, with a small writing desk by the window, a vase filled with dried lilies, and a few worn books she used to read, their pages still marked by her delicate notes in the margins. But the centerpiece of the room was a portrait, the only one he had ever commissioned, a painting that held her likeness with breathtaking detail. Her eyes, soft and kind, seemed to look right through him, capturing the essence of the woman he had loved so completely. In the portrait, she was turned slightly to the side, her gaze gentle yet wise, her lips parted in a faint, wistful smile. She wore a deep green dress that contrasted against her warm, olive-toned skin, and her hair, dark and wavy, framed her face in loose, natural curls. He could almost feel her gaze follow him as he moved, her eyes filled with the love and understanding that had once been his solace. Her name was Isabel. She had been the light in his life, a woman of unassuming grace, who had brought him joy in ways he had never known. They had met in the most ordinary way, through a chance encounter on a rainy evening, just outside the bookstore she adored. She had been standing under the awning, sheltering from the rain, her arms wrapped around a stack of books. When he offered her his umbrella, their connection had sparked like a match in the dark. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, a woman who had taught him that love was not about perfection but about connection, warmth, and simple moments shared in silence. Her death had come unexpectedly, a cruel twist of fate that left him shattered. One day, she was there, vibrant and laughing. The next, she was gone. It was as if someone had ripped the heart out of him, leaving a raw, empty void that he could neither fill nor ignore. He had tried to move on, but each time he even considered it, he felt as though he were betraying her memory. As he stared at the painting, Arthur's fingers grazed the wooden frame, tracing it with a tenderness he rarely showed. He allowed himself to be lost in the memories of their brief, intense time together. The way she had laughed, her hand always touching his shoulder when she found something particularly funny. The way she'd hum old melodies as she moved around, filling every space she entered with a subtle warmth that lingered even after she had left. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence. It was as if he spoke to the portrait itself, hoping she could somehow hear him, somehow understand the depth of his grief. Why did you have to leave? It was here, in the remembrance room, that he let his mask slip, if only for a few minutes. Here, his wealth, his achievements, his image, none of it mattered. He was just a man, broken by the loss of the only person who had ever truly understood him. He hadn't allowed himself to love since her passing, hadn't let anyone in, fearing that no one could ever fill the void she had left behind. But the ache remained, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for moments like these to overwhelm him. Every time he looked into those painted eyes, he was reminded of a love that had been beautiful, fragile, and fleeting. He was reminded of the cost of loving so deeply, a cost he had been paying for 19 years. The room was his refuge, his punishment, and his salvation. And as he lingered there, surrounded by memories, he felt once again the sharp ache of loss mingling with the faint, bittersweet taste of love that would never fade. The rain came down hard that evening, slashing against the cobblestone streets with a relentless rhythm that echoed off the quiet, darkened buildings. Arthur, out for an evening drive to escape the solitude of his mansion, sat back in the leather seat of his car, watching the world blur past the tinted windows. The rain smeared city lights across the glass, casting a faint, melancholic glow that seemed to mirror his mood. As the car rounded a corner near the edge of town, Arthur noticed something unusual. There, huddled beneath a narrow overhang by an old bakery, were two figures, a woman and a young girl, drenched and shivering. Their thin clothes clung to their bodies, soaked through from the rain. The woman was holding the girl close, shielding her as best she could, though it was clear from her slight, worn frame that she had little to give. Arthur's driver slowed instinctively, uncertain, waiting for instructions. Arthur's first instinct was to look away. He rarely involved himself in the lives of others, much less strangers he encountered by chance. But something in the woman's face struck him, a weary resilience, a determination that held her chin up despite her obvious desperation. She held the child with a protective fierceness, her arms wrapped tightly around the girl, as if that alone could ward off the night's chill. Against his better judgment, Arthur opened the car door, stepping out into the rain. The woman looked up, her eyes widening in surprise and caution. She clutched her daughter closer, her posture tense as she assessed him. The child, no more than 6 or 7, had her face buried in her mother's shoulder, small fingers gripping her mother's worn coat with an innocence that belied the harshness of her situation. Arthur approached slowly, careful to keep his voice gentle. "Are you all right?" he asked, though he knew the answer. His voice sounded foreign, even to himself. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken with genuine concern to a stranger. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering between him and the open door of his car. We're just trying to find shelter for the night," she murmured, her voice soft yet edged with pride. "I'll be fine. It's just my daughter." Arthur could see the worry etched into the lines on her face, the way her gaze lingered on her child before shifting back to him. She was clearly exhausted, struggling to maintain a semblance of dignity in a situation that offered none. The girl shifted in her mother's arms, lifting her head just enough to peek at Arthur. Her eyes were wide, innocent but wary, filled with a curiosity that stirred something deep within him. He thought about his life, the vast emptiness of his mansion, the unused rooms, the warmth that had been absent for so long. It was as if the rain had washed away his usual detachment, leaving him exposed, vulnerable to emotions he had long ignored. "You'll catch your death out here," he said quietly, almost to himself. Without fully realizing why, he added, "Come. I have a place you can stay for the night. It's warm." The woman's face registered a mix of relief and hesitation. She glanced down at her daughter, then back up at Arthur, as if weighing her options. She didn't know him, had no reason to trust him, and yet, in this moment, he represented the only chance they had to escape the rain. Finally, she nodded, clutching her daughter closer as they approached the car. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a hint of trust that seemed almost foreign to Arthur. As they climbed into the car, Arthur felt a strange sensation settle over him, a feeling that something significant had shifted within him. For reasons he couldn't quite understand, he was drawn to these strangers, compelled to help them. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had gnawed at him for so long, or perhaps it was the child's innocent gaze that had touched some forgotten part of his heart. Whatever it was, he knew that he couldn't simply turn away. As the car pulled away, carrying them back toward his mansion, Arthur felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. This was an impulse he hadn't planned, a moment that broke his routine, and yet, for the first time in years, he didn't mind. The car ride back to the mansion was shrouded in quiet. The only sounds were the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the soft hum of the engine. Arthur glanced at his unexpected guests, noting the way the woman held her daughter protectively even in the back seat. He realized he didn't know their names, nor did they know his, yet here they were, bound by an unspoken understanding born from desperation and, perhaps, fate. Arthur's mind churned with questions he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. He had always prided himself on being a man of reason, one who valued control over impulse. Yet here he was, offering his home to complete strangers without even a second thought. It unsettled him, this break in his careful solitude, this breach in the fortress he had so meticulously built around his life. He told himself it was just one night, a simple act of kindness. Nothing more. The woman seemed to sense his inner conflict. She turned to him with a faint, hesitant smile, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his intentions. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. We haven't known kindness in a long time." Arthur only nodded, feeling a slight discomfort at the gratitude in her eyes. He wasn't sure if kindness was the right word. Even now, he couldn't explain what had driven him to act. As they neared the mansion, he gave himself a silent reminder. This was temporary. A single night. Tomorrow morning, he would send them on their way, perhaps with a little money to help them, and that would be the end of it. His life would return to the predictable rhythm of solitude he had grown accustomed to. When the mansion came into view, the woman's eyes widened. The massive structure loomed against the night sky, its spires and turrets dark silhouettes under the storm clouds, illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. It was both beautiful and intimidating, a place of wealth and elegance that seemed to belong to a world far removed from theirs. The little girl, pressing her face against the car window, gasped quietly, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and trepidation. As they pulled up to the grand entrance, the car stopped, and Arthur's driver opened the door. Arthur stepped out first, feeling the cool rain on his skin. He turned to help the woman and her daughter out, noticing how they clung to each other, clearly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding them. He motioned toward the door. "Please come inside." The foyer of the mansion was warm, a welcome contrast to the cold rain outside. The high ceilings, adorned with intricate moldings, seemed to stretch up endlessly, and the marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers. The woman looked around, visibly stunned, as if unsure whether she should set foot on such polished floors. The little girl held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes darting around the room, curious yet cautious. Arthur watched them as they took in their surroundings, his own feelings oddly muddled. It was strange to see his home through their eyes, to view its grandeur not as a cold monument to wealth, but as something almost magical, a place of wonder. For a fleeting moment, he recalled a time when he had once wanted to fill this mansion with life, with laughter and companionship. But that vision had died with Isabel, leaving only empty rooms and ghostly memories behind. "Would you like something warm to drink?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. The woman looked at him, clearly taken aback by the offer, as though she hadn't expected him to do more than let them inside. She nodded, her expression grateful. "That would be very kind." "Thank you." He called for a servant to prepare tea and directed them to the sitting room. The woman and her daughter followed him down the hall, their footsteps hesitant, as if they feared disturbing the solemn grandeur of the place. Arthur led them to a large, comfortable room lined with leather armchairs and plush carpets, where a fire was already crackling in the stone fireplace. The warm light flickered across the walls, casting a gentle glow that softened the space, making it feel less imposing. The little girl, now more at ease, moved closer to the fire, her small face illuminated by the flames. Arthur watched her for a moment, noticing the way her eyes lit up as she extended her hands to warm them. The innocence in her gaze struck him, reminding him of a time long ago when he, too, had looked at the world with wonder, untainted by loss and regret. As they settled into the armchairs, Arthur couldn't ignore the strange feeling stirring within him, a mix of protectiveness and connection. It was as if these strangers had disrupted something dormant inside him, unearthing emotions he had buried long ago. He knew nothing about them, yet he felt inexplicably drawn to their presence, as though they were meant to be here, in his home, breaking the silence that had once felt like his only comfort. "Tell me," he said quietly, looking at the woman. "How did you find yourself in circumstances like these?" The woman hesitated, glancing down at her daughter before answering. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet filled with a strength that belied her worn appearance. "Life hasn't been easy for us," she admitted, choosing her words carefully. "We've moved from place to place, hoping for something better." Her answer was vague, and Arthur sensed she was reluctant to share more. He didn't press her, respecting her guardedness. But he could see in her eyes the shadows of hardship, the traces of a story that went deeper than words could convey. And for reasons he couldn't quite fathom, he wanted to know more. As the tea arrived, Arthur handed a cup to each of them, watching as they sipped it gratefully. The warmth of the tea seemed to ease their tension, and the woman looked at him with an expression that seemed almost hopeful, as if daring to believe in kindness again. Arthur realized, with a pang of guilt, that he could offer them only temporary refuge. Yet, as he sat there, the room filled with the soft sound of the fire crackling and the gentle murmur of voices, he felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, a whisper of connection. Arthur guided the woman and her daughter to a guest suite on the mansion's east wing, a part of the house he rarely visited. The room was opulent but not overwhelming, a soft canopy bed draped in pale, luxurious linens, heavy velvet curtains drawn to keep the storm's chill at bay, and a few carefully chosen decorations that lent warmth to the space. The woman and child stood at the threshold, their expressions wavering between awe and disbelief. "It's beautiful," the woman murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her daughter, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. The little girl tugged at her mother's hand, eyes sparkling with an excitement that managed to break through her exhaustion. Arthur watched them from a distance, surprised by the satisfaction he felt in seeing their reaction. He hadn't intended to open himself up to anyone, much less strangers in need. But their presence stirred a faint but unmistakable warmth inside him, a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience for years. He had grown used to the silence, had almost convinced himself that solitude was all he deserved. Yet here they were, these two souls, casting gentle ripples into the still waters of his life. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. "If you need anything, just ask." The woman's gaze softened. She placed a hand over her heart, as if to convey her unspoken gratitude. "Thank you, truly. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't met you tonight." Arthur nodded curtly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He had done this out of an impulse he still didn't understand, a split-second decision, born of a compassion he thought had long been buried. He assured himself it was just one night, an act of charity that would conclude in the morning. Yet, despite his own reasoning, he felt an inexplicable reluctance to let them leave. The little girl, now a little braver, tiptoed around the room, peeking behind curtains and running her hands along the soft bedspread. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Is this your house, mister?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Arthur managed a small smile.
"Yes."
"It's my home. Do you live here all alone?" Her innocent question pierced through him, cutting straight to the heart of his loneliness. Arthur hesitated, glancing at the woman, who gently urged her daughter to hush. "That's enough, dear. Don't trouble him with questions." But Arthur shook his head, caught off guard by how much the question lingered in his mind. "No trouble at all," he replied softly, almost to himself. Yes, I live here alone. The girl tilted her head, studying him with a child's candid curiosity. A house this big must get lonely. Arthur felt a pang he couldn't quite name. She had struck on a truth he rarely acknowledged, a truth he kept hidden even from himself. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It does. The woman cast him a sympathetic look, as though she understood more than he had intended to reveal. There was a connection forming between them, fragile yet undeniable, an understanding that transcended words. She seemed to sense his pain, the same way he sensed her quiet resilience, and in that shared silence, a bond began to take root. He left them to settle in, retreating to his own quarters with a mixture of relief and restlessness. He had intended to remain detached, yet he couldn't shake the image of the child's wide eyes and the gratitude in the mother's gaze. Their presence lingered in his mind, unsettling him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was supposed to be their benefactor, a distant figure who would help them for a night and then resume his life of solitude. But as he lay awake, he realized he had already begun to care for them, drawn to their warmth as a wanderer drawn to the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. In the silence of his room, he reflected on his own unexpected compassion. This wasn't merely charity, it was something deeper, a faint echo of the connection he had once felt with Isabel. A sense of responsibility, a desire to protect, a glimmer of purpose. These were emotions he had locked away for nearly 2 decades, yet now they surfaced with a force he couldn't ignore. As the hours passed, he found himself listening for any sound from the room down the hall, the soft murmur of voices, a light laugh, the rustle of movement. For the first time in years, his mansion felt less like an empty shell and more like a home, filled with the presence of others. It unsettled him, but it also offered a strange, fragile comfort. In that quiet darkness, Arthur realized with a mix of dread and hope that their arrival had already changed him, that no matter what happened in the morning, his life would never return to its previous silence. And despite himself, he didn't entirely mind. The storm raged outside, rain slashing against the windows and filling the mansion with an almost soothing rhythm. Arthur lay awake, staring at the high, vaulted ceiling of his bedroom, his mind far too restless for sleep. He hadn't had anyone in his home for years, and the quiet presence of the woman and her daughter seemed to fill every corner of the house with a subtle energy. It was a strange sensation. He could almost feel their warmth, a faint reminder of the life and laughter that once filled his days. After what felt like hours, Arthur gave up on sleep. He sat up, wrapped his robe around himself, and wandered out into the dimly lit hallway. He was surprised to find himself drawn toward the guest room, almost as if his feet had a mind of their own. He didn't intend to disturb them. He simply wanted to assure himself that they were still there, that their presence was real. As he approached the door, he hesitated, feeling uncharacteristically uncertain. He knew he had no reason to feel attached to these strangers, yet he couldn't deny the comfort their company brought him. He stood silently outside the door, listening for any sound. A faint rustle reached his ears, followed by the quiet murmur of the woman's voice, soothing and comforting, as if she were telling her daughter a bedtime story. The child's laughter followed, a soft, breathy giggle that made Arthur's chest tighten. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard laughter in his home, and the sound brought a pang of nostalgia, so sharp it was almost painful. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine that this was his family, that he was simply a father checking on his loved ones, his life filled with the warmth and joy he had lost all those years ago. As he lingered, an old memory began to surface, one he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He remembered how he and Isabel used to sit up late at night, talking and laughing until they couldn't keep their eyes open. She would rest her head on his shoulder, and they'd share stories and dreams, as though they had all the time in the world. Back then, he had believed in forever. The ache of her absence hit him hard. He realized, standing there in the dark, that he had buried himself in wealth and isolation to escape the pain of her memory. But now, the presence of this woman and child had resurrected a piece of himself he had long thought dead. A creak in the hallway pulled him from his reverie. He turned to see the woman standing there, wrapped in a blanket, her expression gentle but surprised. She held a small candle, the flickering light illuminating her face and casting shadows that softened her features. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her voice a whisper. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Arthur shook his head, feeling slightly foolish for lingering outside their room. No need to apologize. I just couldn't sleep." She nodded, a sympathetic look crossing her face. "Neither could I. My daughter finally drifted off, but, well, it's been a long time since we've had a place like this to stay in. It's almost overwhelming." Arthur managed a faint smile, feeling oddly connected to her in that moment. "I understand," he replied, though he was certain she couldn't fully comprehend the depths of his own turmoil. "This house, it can feel too large, too quiet." She looked around, as if trying to imagine what it must be like to live here alone. "I can't imagine. All this space, all this quiet. I suppose it's easy to feel lost in a place like this." "Yes," he agreed, more openly than he'd intended. "It is." The silence between them grew heavy, filled with unspoken words and shared loneliness. Arthur felt a strange impulse to tell her about Isabel, to share his grief with someone who might understand, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent so many years in silence that opening up now felt almost impossible. Instead, he simply nodded toward her candle. "Can I get you anything? Perhaps some tea?" She shook her head, her gaze kind but weary. "No, thank you. You've already done more than enough. My daughter and I, we're not used to kindness. Not like this." Her words stirred something deep within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know why he cared so much, but he wanted to offer them more than a mere night's shelter. He wanted to be the comfort they had lost, to be the kindness they hadn't known. Perhaps, he thought, by helping them, he might finally find some solace himself. "Well," he said, his voice softer than usual, "you're safe here. Take all the time you need to rest." They shared a small, understanding nod before she turned back into the room, her figure retreating into the darkness. Arthur lingered for a moment longer, letting the warmth of the encounter sink in. He was struck by how natural it felt to care about someone again, to feel a sense of belonging, even if only for a brief moment. He returned to his own room, his heart unexpectedly lighter, though his mind was still tangled with memories of Isabel. For the first time in years, he lay in bed and felt something other than grief, a strange, tentative hope, fragile yet powerful. It whispered to him in the darkness, a quiet promise that perhaps he hadn't lost everything after all. Arthur lay back in his bed, staring at the patterns the firelight cast on the ceiling, his mind awash with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to entertain in years. The quiet presence of the woman and her daughter in his home had ignited memories and emotions he had long buried, as though their laughter and warmth had unlocked a door he had sealed shut since Isabel's death. He remembered the first few years after Isabel was gone, the restless nights, the endless pacing through the mansion's halls. Back then, he had tried to fill the void with material things, each piece of artwork or lavish addition to the house meant to distract him from the empty place inside. But those distractions had been fleeting, the sense of satisfaction short-lived, like trying to hold water in his hands. Eventually, he had given up trying to fill that void, resigning himself to a life of silence and isolation. He had believed his grief was his to bear alone, a penance for daring to love someone as deeply as he had loved her. But tonight, his heart felt strangely light, as though a weight he'd carried for so long had shifted, if only slightly. He couldn't deny the comfort he felt in having others nearby, in hearing soft laughter and whispers through the walls. It was a stark contrast to the relentless solitude he had known, the quiet that had once been his only companion. And while he knew that his guests would likely leave in the morning, he found himself dreading their departure, fearing the return of that unending silence. As he lay there, his thoughts kept circling back to the woman. He hadn't even asked her name, yet he felt as though he understood her, recognized something in her spirit that resonated with his own pain. She, too, seemed to carry a weight, An invisible burden he had glimpsed in her eyes, in the way she held her daughter close. Her resilience, her quiet strength, reminded him of Isabel, who had faced life's trials with the same gentle determination. The woman's presence was like a balm to his soul, soothing and unsettling all at once. The memory of their brief conversation replayed in his mind. She had spoken of kindness, of how rare it was for her and her daughter. It had been a long time since Arthur had thought of himself as capable of kindness. His life had become so focused on his own grief, his own pain, that he had closed himself off to the suffering of others. Yet tonight, he felt something shift within him, a desire to help, to be more than the hollow, grieving man he had become. Sleep continued to evade him, his mind drifting from the present to the past and back again. He wondered what had brought this woman and her child to such hardship. They seemed out of place in their threadbare clothes, their worn expressions, as though life had thrust them into misfortune they hadn't been prepared for. And despite himself, he felt a growing need to understand them, to know their story. He rose from his bed and moved to the window, gazing out over the darkened landscape. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground shrouded in a mist that clung to the trees, making the world outside appear soft and dreamlike. It was a night that invited contemplation, a night that seemed to whisper of second chances and unexpected connections. As the hours ticked by, Arthur allowed himself to wonder if this encounter was more than mere chance. There was something almost fated in their meeting, as though some unseen force had brought them into his life at the precise moment he was ready to receive them. He found himself hoping that their time together wouldn't end with the morning's light, that perhaps they might stay a little longer, allowing him to experience the warmth he had long believed lost to him. With a sigh, Arthur returned to bed, finally closing his eyes. He drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with blurred images of Isabel, of laughter and warmth, and the faint, comforting presence of the woman and her daughter. For the first time in years, his dreams were not haunted by grief alone but touched by a fragile hope, as if his heart, though scarred and worn, was beginning to awaken. Arthur woke in the early hours, the faintest hint of dawn beginning to seep through the curtains. The house was quiet, but as he lay there in the stillness, he heard something faint, a soft shuffling sound, almost imperceptible but unmistakably human. His senses sharpened, and he felt an inexplicable urgency to investigate. He slipped out of bed, pulling on his robe and stepping into the dim hallway. The air was cool, carrying the lingering scent of rain and a faint trace of the lavender oil he kept in the remembrance room. Following the sound, he moved quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the plush carpets, his pulse quickening as he neared the source of the noise. In the half-light of dawn, he spotted her. The woman, his guest, stood at the end of the hallway, near the entrance to the remembrance room. She held her candle close, casting a warm glow around her as she gazed at the closed door, her expression thoughtful, almost reverent. Arthur paused, watching her from the shadows. There was something about her posture, her quiet curiosity, that reminded him of someone, of Isabel. It was unsettling, yet he felt compelled to remain still, observing her as she traced her fingers along the doorframe, as though sensing the significance of the room on the other side. For a moment, he considered stepping forward to speak with her, but something held him back. Instead, he simply watched, captivated by her presence. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant and reflective, as though caught between memories and reality. There was a vulnerability to her in that moment, a rawness that made him feel as though he were glimpsing something deeply private. Then, as if sensing his gaze, she turned, her eyes meeting his in the semi-darkness. She didn't look startled. Rather, there was a quiet understanding in her expression, a knowing that took him by surprise. They stood in silence, the distance between them both intimate and immense. I didn't mean to intrude, she whispered, breaking the stillness. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. I couldn't sleep, and I was wandering. I hope that's all right. Arthur nodded, gathering himself. It's fine. You're a guest here. You're free to move about as you like. His voice came out gentle, softened by the connection he felt to her. "This room," he began, uncertain of what he wanted to say. "It's special to me." She nodded, as though she already understood. "I could feel that," she replied. Her gaze shifted back to the door, lingering there with a kind of wistful sadness he couldn't quite place. There's something about it, a sense of memory, of love. Her words stirred something deep within him, a feeling both comforting and unsettling. It was as if she saw through the walls he had so carefully built, sensing the grief and memories that lay hidden behind that closed door. Part of him wanted to invite her inside, to let her see the portrait of Isabel, to share his story in a way he hadn't done with anyone else. But another part of him recoiled, fearing the vulnerability that came with opening himself up. "Have you," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "have you lost someone?" Her question was gentle, unintrusive, yet it carried an understanding that felt almost uncanny. Arthur hesitated, glancing down at the carpeted floor before meeting her gaze again. He could see the same look of sorrow in her eyes, a reflection of his own pain. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." She nodded, as though acknowledging a shared sorrow. "I understand that pain. It's something you carry, isn't it? Something that never really leaves." Arthur felt his heart tighten, the truth of her words cutting through him.
"Yes."
It stays with you, like a shadow." For a moment, they stood there in silence, connected by the unspoken weight of their losses. He felt a strange urge to tell her about Isabel, to share the story of the love he had lost, but words failed him. Instead, he found himself drawn to her presence, to the comfort she seemed to offer without even trying. It was as though she had stepped into his life to remind him that he was not alone, that others, too, carried the weight of memory and love. The silence between them grew, filled with a gentle understanding that didn't require words. Finally, she broke the quiet, her voice soft and reflective. "I lost someone too. Many years ago." Her eyes drifted back to the remembrance room, lingering there with a sadness that felt achingly familiar. "Someone who meant the world to me." Arthur's heart pounded, a strange recognition building inside him. There was something about her presence, her words, that resonated with a part of him he thought he had locked away. The familiarity in her gaze, the gentle sorrow in her voice, it was as if they shared a bond he couldn't quite explain. A part of him wanted to press further, to ask about the person she had lost, to find out if their stories intersected in ways he couldn't yet understand. But before he could ask, she took a step back, her hand still resting lightly on the doorframe. "I didn't mean to wake you." I'll go back to my room now," she said, offering him a faint, appreciative smile. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, watching as she drifted back down the hall toward her room, the candle's glow fading as she turned the corner. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door of the remembrance room, his thoughts a whirl of confusion and curiosity. Arthur returned to his own room, but sleep continued to elude him. He lay awake, replaying their conversation in his mind, searching for the source of the strange familiarity he felt toward her. The way she had spoken of loss, the understanding in her eyes, it was almost as if she had known Isabel herself. And yet, he knew that was impossible, wasn't it? As dawn finally broke, casting soft light over the mansion, Arthur felt a sense of anticipation building within him. He knew that he needed answers, that he could no longer ignore the inexplicable connection he felt to this woman. Something told him that she held a piece of the story he had never known, a chapter of his past that had somehow found its way back to him. And in that quiet dawn, he made a silent promise to himself. He would discover the truth. No matter what memories it unearthed, no matter what wounds it reopened, he would uncover the reason she had entered his life. The morning sunlight crept through the tall windows of the mansion, casting soft golden rays across the hallways. Arthur hadn't slept. His mind had been too busy unraveling the strange connection he felt toward his guest. He rose early, his curiosity mingling with an urgency he couldn't explain. As he made his way down the hallway, he caught a glimpse of her in the remembrance room, standing in front of Isabel's portrait. For a moment, he simply watched from the doorway, his heart pounding. The woman stood still, her gaze fixed on the painting, her posture tense with emotion. The light from the windows bathed the portrait in a soft glow, illuminating Isabel's face, the soft curve of her cheek, the calm strength in her eyes, the faint, wistful smile on her lips. And there, standing before it, was this stranger whose presence had stirred up memories and feelings he thought he had long since buried. Arthur stepped forward, clearing his throat softly, so as not to startle her. She turned, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hushed. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I couldn't look away." "She's beautiful." Arthur nodded, stepping further into the room, his eyes shifting to the portrait. She was. Her name was Isabel. A silence settled between them as they both looked at the painting, bound by a shared reverence for the woman whose presence lingered in this room. Arthur's voice softened as he continued, almost speaking to himself as he explained. She passed away many years ago. This room is all I have left of her." His words hung in the air, heavy with the sorrow he rarely voiced. The woman's eyes softened as she looked at him, her expression filled with understanding. I know this may sound strange," she began, her voice wavering, "but I feel as if I know her." Arthur's heart skipped. He studied her face, searching for an explanation, his mind racing to make sense of the connection between them. "How could that be?" he asked, barely able to hide the tremor in his voice. "You've never been here before. You said you were just passing through." The woman took a deep breath, her eyes shifting back to the portrait as though trying to find the right words. "I loved someone once a long time ago. He meant everything to me. But we were separated, and I lost him before I could say goodbye." She reached out, her hand trembling as it grazed the edge of the portrait frame. "There's something about her, something in her eyes, it reminds me of him. The same kindness, the same strength." Arthur's chest tightened, his mind racing with questions. Who was this woman who seemed to carry the same sorrow he did? And how was it possible that her memories, her lost love, resonated so closely with the memories he held of Isabel? As he watched her, a realization began to take shape, faint and unformed, yet compelling. He could feel the weight of something unresolved between them, as though the past had cast a shadow over both their lives, drawing them together across time and circumstance. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me more about the person you lost." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the frame of the painting in a way that was both gentle and reverent. "He was someone I cherished. He had dreams, a life full of possibility, and he loved deeply, like your Isabel." Her voice broke slightly, and she paused, collecting herself. "But life was cruel, and we were torn apart. It happened so quickly that I could never say goodbye." The pain in her voice resonated with his own, and Arthur felt the undeniable truth taking root in his heart. He didn't know how, but he was certain now that this woman's life and his own were connected in ways they had yet to uncover. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a revelation, on the brink of understanding a chapter of Isabel's life that had been hidden from him. He drew in a breath, feeling the question forming in his mind. "Do you remember his name?" She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "His name was Gabriel. He was Isabel's brother." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to shift, the weight of her words pressing down on him, filling the space with a truth he hadn't known he needed. Gabriel, Isabel's brother. The name was familiar, like a distant memory, yet he hadn't thought of him in years. He remembered her speaking fondly of him, remembered the way her face would light up whenever she mentioned her younger brother. "You," Arthur struggled to find his voice. "You were with Gabriel's?" The woman nodded, her hand still resting on the frame of Isabel's portrait. "Yes. We loved each other." He spoke of his sister often, how much he admired her, how she'd helped raise him after their parents passed. He said she was the one person who understood him, who never judged him. Arthur felt a wave of emotion crash over him, a mixture of shock, grief, and an unexpected surge of connection. This woman, this stranger who had wandered into his life on a stormy night, was bound to him through the very family he had loved and lost. Through Gabriel, through Isabel, their lives were inexplicably intertwined. He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "And when he passed, you lost everything." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes." I tried to move on, but the grief never left. He was my world, and when he was gone, I couldn't find a reason to stay. I wandered, searching for something, anything, to fill the emptiness. Arthur's heart ached with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. He realized that in helping her, in offering her and her daughter shelter, he had found a way to honor Isabel and Gabriel, to mend the broken pieces of a story that had gone unfinished. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps his loneliness had led him here, to this moment, for a purpose he was only beginning to understand. They stood there, united by shared sorrow, each of them carrying the legacy of two souls who had once loved fiercely. And as Arthur reached out, placing his hand over hers on the edge of the frame, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, as though the ghosts of his past had finally found rest. Arthur and the woman stood in the quiet of the remembrance room, the weight of shared memories settling around them like a protective cocoon. There was a pause, thick with emotion, as they both absorbed the revelation. It was as if the mansion itself were listening, bearing witness to the untangling of a past woven together by loss and love. Arthur's heart raced, each beat pulling him deeper into the past. He could scarcely believe that the woman standing before him, a stranger only yesterday, had once shared such a deep bond with Isabel's brother. He looked into her eyes, searching for the answers to questions he had yet to ask. "You loved Gabriel," he said, his voice soft but laden with understanding. She nodded, her gaze fixed on Isabel's portrait, her eyes misty with the pain of memories long kept silent. "He was everything to me. We had dreams, plans for a life together." Her voice wavered as she recalled those long-buried hopes. "We would sit and talk about the future, about family, about the life we wanted to build. But it was all taken away so quickly." She paused, swallowing hard. "I never imagined I'd find a piece of him here, with you, after all this time." Arthur's throat tightened, his heart straining against the walls he had so carefully built. Isabel had spoken of Gabriel often, especially in the early days of their love, when she would describe her family with a warmth and pride that had endeared her to him. "Gabriel was special to her," Arthur murmured. "He was her little brother, her friend, almost like her child. She would have done anything for him." The woman nodded, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Yes. He used to tell me stories of their childhood, how Isabel would protect him, comfort him after their parents passed. He said she was the one person who truly understood him." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "In a way, I felt as though I knew her through him." Arthur's chest tightened. For years, he had believed he was the only one left to carry Isabel's memory, the only one bound by the ache of her loss. But now he realized that this woman, a stranger in so many ways, had also been bound to Isabel through a love she, too, had lost. He cleared his throat, struggling to contain the emotions rising within him. You never told me your name." She looked up at him, surprised, and then offered a soft, almost apologetic smile. "Evelyn. My name is Evelyn." "Evelyn," he repeated, tasting the familiarity of it, as though he'd always known it. "And your daughter, what's her name?" Evelyn's face softened, and a gentle pride entered her gaze. "Her name is Belle." She glanced down, a hint of sorrow in her expression. "I named her after Isabel. After Gabriel was gone, it felt like a way to keep a part of them with me." Arthur's breath caught, an unexpected wave of tenderness filling him. The child who had brought a light into his home, who had touched his heart with her innocent gaze, was named for the woman he had loved. He felt an overwhelming need to protect her, to offer her the life he had once dreamed of building with Isabel. Evelyn's gaze returned to the painting, her eyes filled with longing and regret. "I thought I had buried the past, that I'd moved on," she confessed. But every day, I've carried them both with me. Gabriel, and the sister he adored. Your Isabel. She looked down, her voice breaking. Losing them both was like losing parts of myself. Arthur reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder.
I understand.
I've carried Isabel's memory for years, holding onto it like a lifeline, even when it felt like a burden. He took a shaky breath. But perhaps we were meant to find each other, to remember them together. Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and gratitude. It feels that way, she whispered, her voice trembling. After all these years, it feels like they brought us together. They stood there, enveloped in a silence that spoke more than words could. For the first time, Arthur felt the pain in his heart begin to ease, replaced by a tentative but powerful sense of peace. He was not alone in his grief, and neither was she. They were bound not only by sorrow but by love, the love they had shared with Isabel and Gabriel, the love that still lingered, even after so many years. As they stepped back from the portrait, Arthur felt a strange, unspoken resolve settle within him. Evelyn, he said, his voice steady, I don't want you and Belle to leave. This house, it's been empty for too long, and so has my life. He looked down, his voice softening. I would like for you to stay. Not just for a night, but however long you need. Perhaps we can help each other find peace. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her expression one of disbelief and quiet joy. Are you sure? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. We've been strangers, and yet, I feel as though we're already family. Arthur nodded, a sense of clarity washing over him. Yes, Evelyn. I am sure. He looked toward the portrait of Isabel, feeling a profound connection to her in that moment, as if she, too, approved. I think this is what Isabel and Gabriel would have wanted. Evelyn smiled, her tears spilling over, her relief palpable. For the first time, they shared a genuine, unguarded moment of connection, one that felt as fragile as it was meaningful. They were no longer two strangers, but two souls who had been brought together by fate, by love, and by the people who had meant the world to them. Evelyn and Arthur sat together in the remembrance room, the morning sunlight filtering in through the tall windows and casting a soft glow over them. Their conversation had flowed naturally, as though they had known each other for years, as though every word exchanged was part of a conversation that had begun long ago. Each memory, each story, was like a thread, binding them closer, bridging the gap between past and present. Evelyn spoke of Gabriel with a quiet reverence, her voice gentle as she recounted stories of his humor, his dreams, and his boundless kindness. She described how they had met, the long conversations they'd shared by firelight, their whispered dreams of a future that was never meant to be. Arthur listened intently, feeling as though he were meeting Gabriel for the first time through her eyes. He could see now why Isabel had loved her brother so dearly, and he felt a profound connection to Evelyn, who had known and cherished him in a way that only deepened Arthur's respect for her. Gabriel had a way of making everyone feel seen, Evelyn said softly, a wistful smile on her face. He was always so gentle, so patient. I never felt alone when he was with me. He once told me he learned it all from Isabel, that she taught him how to be kind in a world that often wasn't. Arthur's chest tightened as he thought back to the early days with Isabel, remembering how she had been a force of light in his life, bringing warmth and compassion to everyone around her. She had been the first person to break through his own guarded heart, and now, sitting here with Evelyn, he realized that her influence had extended far beyond him. Isabel was remarkable, he murmured, his gaze fixed on her portrait. She taught me things I didn't even realize I needed to learn. Patience, forgiveness, love. He felt a pang of sorrow, knowing he had never fully repaid her for the happiness she had given him. Losing her left me hollow. Evelyn reached out, her hand covering his, her touch warm and grounding. But you've kept her memory alive, she said, her voice steady. You've honored her in a way that speaks volumes, even in your pain. Arthur looked down at her hand on his, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. For so many years, he had grieved in silence, believing that his sorrow was his alone to carry. But now, with Evelyn beside him, he felt that weight lift, as if sharing it allowed him to finally begin to heal. Their conversation drifted to quieter topics, moments filled with laughter and shared silences that were no longer burdened with loneliness. They spoke of Belle, the bright-eyed girl whose innocence and curiosity had breathed life into the mansion. Evelyn's face lit up whenever she mentioned her daughter, her love for the child evident in every word. "She reminds me of him sometimes," Evelyn said, her gaze softening. "She has Gabriel's kindness, his gentleness. And I see Isabel in her, too, in the way she lights up a room without even trying." Arthur smiled, imagining the girl's laughter filling the empty halls, her presence a testament to the love and hope that he and Evelyn had both believed lost. "Bella's brought something to this house that I thought was gone forever," he admitted. "She's given me a reason to keep going." Evelyn looked up at him, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Maybe that's what all of this is about. Maybe we were meant to find each other, to help each other remember, but also to find a way forward." Her voice grew soft, thoughtful. "Perhaps we can build something here, something for Belle. Something like a family." Arthur's heart raced at the word family, the idea settling into his mind like a spark that ignited a long-dormant part of his soul. Family, a word he hadn't dared to think of since Isabel's passing, a concept he had locked away with the rest of his dreams. But now, looking into Evelyn's hopeful gaze, he felt the possibility take root, fragile yet powerful. He drew in a breath, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Yes, Evelyn. I think we can." Just then, the door creaked open, and Belle appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking up at them with a sleepy smile. "Mama," she murmured, padding over to Evelyn and climbing into her lap, her small face beaming with trust. Arthur's gaze softened as he watched the tender interaction between mother and daughter. Belle looked up at him, her eyes bright with the same innocent curiosity he had seen the night before. "Will we stay here, Mama?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Evelyn looked down at Belle, then up at Arthur, her eyes filled with a question that he already knew the answer to. Arthur felt a swell of emotion, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years, as he nodded slowly, offering a gentle smile. "Yes, Belle," he said, his voice steady and sure. "If you and your mother would like to stay, you are welcome here. This can be your home." Belle's face lit up, her joy palpable as she clapped her hands in delight. "Really?" she asked, looking between Arthur and Evelyn, her excitement contagious. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with tears, her gratitude silent but clear. "Yes, darling," she whispered, holding Belle close. "We're home." In that moment, the mansion, which had once felt so hollow, so empty, was filled with a warmth that went beyond anything Arthur had known. It was as if the shadows that had haunted him for years were finally retreating, replaced by the light of a new beginning, a life shared, a love reborn, a family reclaimed from the ashes of loss. As he looked at Evelyn and Belle, Arthur felt a sense of completion, a healing that came not from forgetting but from remembering together. For the first time in 19 years, he felt whole, his heart alive with a love that Isabel and Gabriel had left behind, now finding new life in the family he had never expected to find. They sat together, watching the sun rise, its light spilling over the room and casting a gentle glow on Isabel's portrait. And in the golden silence, Arthur knew that he had found peace, that the mansion, once a fortress of grief, had transformed into a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of new memories waiting to be made. In the days that followed, the mansion seemed to come alive in ways Arthur had forgotten it could. Belle's laughter echoed down the once empty halls, her small footsteps pattering as she explored each corner, bringing a lightness that filled every room. Arthur found himself watching her with a sense of wonder and gratitude, surprised by how easily she had woven herself into the fabric of his life. Evelyn, too, had settled into the mansion as if she'd always belonged there. She would sit with Arthur in the evenings by the fireplace, sharing stories of Gabriel and listening as Arthur recounted his own memories of Isabel. In those quiet hours, as they pieced together the fragments of their lost loved ones, They found solace, their lives becoming interwoven in a way neither of them had anticipated. One evening, after Belle had gone to bed, Evelyn joined Arthur in the study. She had found an old album tucked away in one of the shelves, a collection of photographs Arthur had taken over the years, but had rarely looked through since Isabel's passing. They sat together, leafing through the pages, their fingers tracing the faces of the people they had loved and lost. Evelyn's breath caught as she paused on one particular photo. It was a faded image of Isabel and Gabriel, taken on one of Arthur's rare gatherings, back when his home had been filled with laughter and life. Isabel was laughing, her arm draped around her brother, and Gabriel looked at her with a warmth that spoke of their unbreakable bond. "They look so happy," Evelyn murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She traced Gabriel's face with her fingertip, a bittersweet smile on her lips. He always spoke of her like she was the world to him. Arthur nodded, a quiet smile tugging at his lips as he remembered that day. That was Isabel's gift, to make everyone feel cherished. He paused, glancing at Evelyn. "And she must have known about you, about Gabriel's love for you. I'm certain she would be overjoyed to know we found each other like this." Evelyn's eyes shimmered with tears, and she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and hope. "Do you think maybe this was their way of bringing us together? That somehow they've been watching over us, guiding us here?" Arthur felt the truth of her words resonate within him, as if Isabel and Gabriel's presence was there with them, encouraging them to embrace this second chance. He reached over, covering her hand with his, feeling a connection that went beyond friendship, beyond shared memories. It was a bond born from the very love that Isabel and Gabriel had instilled in them, a bond that had been waiting all these years to be rekindled. As they sat together, wrapped in the warmth of their shared past, Arthur felt a sense of completion, as though he had found the family he had longed for. He no longer felt like an observer in his own life. He was living, feeling, and embracing the joy of connection. With each passing day, Arthur's feelings for Evelyn grew deeper, more complex. She had become not only a friend but a confidant, someone who understood his pain without judgment, who had seen his flaws and his sorrow, and accepted him fully. It was as if the years of isolation and grief had peeled away, leaving him exposed yet profoundly alive. One afternoon, as they strolled through the garden, he noticed how the sunlight fell on her face, casting a gentle glow that reminded him of the past and hinted at a new future. Belle skipped ahead of them, her laughter ringing out as she chased butterflies across the flowers. Arthur watched them both, his heart swelling with an emotion he had once thought lost to him. Evelyn turned to him, catching his gaze, her eyes searching his with a vulnerability that mirrored his own. "Arthur," she began, her voice soft, "I want to thank you. Not just for opening your home to us, but for giving us a place where we can belong." Her words struck him deeply. "It's me who should be thanking you, Evelyn. I had forgotten what it felt like to care, to have a family. You and Belle, you've given me that." They stood there, the air thick with words unspoken, emotions they were both still hesitant to name. But as he looked into her eyes, Arthur knew that this was no longer just about honoring Isabel and Gabriel's memory. It was about finding a new purpose, a new love that felt like a continuation of all he had lost, yet was wholly his own. Evelyn stepped closer, and he felt her hand slip into his, their fingers entwining naturally, as though they were two pieces of the same puzzle, finally joined together. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. Their connection, born of love and loss, was as real and undeniable as the life they were building together. The past held no power over Arthur anymore. For the first time, he felt as though he could look back at his memories of Isabel without the sharp sting of grief. Instead, he felt gratitude, a quiet, steady love that lived on in his heart. Isabel had taught him how to love, and now he was ready to open himself to that love again, to honor her memory by embracing the life he had in front of him. He knew there would still be moments of sadness, times when he would miss Isabel and Gabriel, when the ache of their absence would resurface. But Evelyn and Belle had shown him that love didn't end with loss. It transformed. It found new shapes, new homes. And now, He was ready to accept that love again, to build a family and a future. One evening, as they sat together with Belle between them, the child looked up at Arthur and asked, "Will you always be here, Arthur?" He looked at Evelyn, feeling her gentle smile beside him, and then at Belle, her innocence and warmth filling him with a sense of purpose. "Yes, Belle," he replied, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "I'll always be here. For both of you." Belle smiled, content, and nestled closer, her small hand resting on his. Evelyn reached for his other hand, and together they sat in the glow of the fire, a family bound by love, loss, and the strength they had found in one another. The mansion, once a symbol of Arthur's grief and solitude, was now filled with laughter, warmth, and the vibrant, steady pulse of a new life. And as they sat together, Arthur felt at peace, his heart no longer burdened by the past, but alive with the promise of a future filled with love, healing, and hope. The days turned into weeks, and each morning, Arthur woke to the sounds of life filling his once silent mansion. Belle's laughter would drift down the halls as she played, and he would hear Evelyn singing softly to herself as she prepared breakfast, her voice filling the air with a warmth he hadn't known he missed. The mansion had transformed from a relic of past sorrows to a place alive with love and belonging. One afternoon, as Arthur sat in the study, Evelyn entered, her expression thoughtful. She closed the door behind her, as though preparing to share something private. "Arthur," she began, sitting across from him, "I think it's time Belle and I moved on. You've already given us more than we could have hoped for, and I don't want to impose any longer." Her voice was calm, but he could see the sadness in her eyes, the reluctance in her gaze. She was offering him a choice, a chance to reclaim his solitude if that was what he truly wanted. Arthur felt a pang of fear at the thought of them leaving. It struck him just how empty his life would feel without their presence, without the sense of purpose and joy they had brought back into his home. He had lost Isabel once, had endured a grief that had nearly broken him, and he knew he couldn't bear to lose Evelyn and Belle too. "Evelyn," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you and Belle belong here. This isn't an imposition. It's a home, a place where we can be together, where we can heal." He paused, gathering his thoughts.
"Please stay."
"Not as guests, but as family." Evelyn's face softened, relief and joy mingling in her expression. "Are you sure, Arthur?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I'm more certain of this than I've been of anything in a long time." A tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek, and she nodded, her hand tightening in his. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken promises settling between them, a future together forming quietly, rooted in understanding and shared history. Over the next few weeks, Arthur found himself settling into a new rhythm, a life filled not only with memories of Isabel but with new memories made with Evelyn and Belle. They began to carve out a routine together, each day bringing small moments of joy and connection. Arthur had never imagined that he could feel this way again, that his heart, once so tightly bound by sorrow, could open up to love and family. He and Evelyn shared the responsibilities of the household, cooking meals together, tending to the garden, and planning small outings to nearby towns. Belle was a constant source of light, her boundless energy and curiosity transforming the mansion from a place of ghosts to a lively home filled with laughter. She would run through the halls, bringing flowers she'd picked from the garden or showing Arthur the latest treasure she'd found, a fallen bird's feather, a particularly round pebble, a leaf shaped like a heart. One evening, Belle pulled Arthur outside to show him the fireflies glowing in the twilight. They watched together as the small lights blinked in the darkness, and Belle took his hand, her small fingers entwining with his. "Thank you for letting us stay, Arthur," she said, her voice as soft as the night. "I like it here. It feels safe." Arthur felt his heart swell with affection, a warmth that filled him with gratitude and peace. "I like it too, Belle. You and your mother have made this place feel like home." Evelyn watched from the doorway, her eyes shining with a quiet pride. She had seen the transformation in Arthur, the way he had come back to life, finding meaning and joy in the small moments they shared. It was a gift she hadn't expected to find, a home for herself and Belle, and a love that felt both new and familiar. In the months that followed, Arthur grew accustomed to the laughter, the warmth, the simple joys of being part of a family. The mansion had become a home, filled not only with memories of the past, but with the promise of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. With Evelyn and Belle by his side, he no longer felt burdened by loneliness or haunted by the shadows of what could have been. Instead, he found himself living fully in the present, embracing each day with a gratitude that had transformed him. One afternoon, as they sat around the table after a meal, Belle looked up at him, her gaze serious. "Arthur, are you my family now?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Arthur exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with encouragement. He turned back to Belle, his heart swelling with affection. "Yes, Belle," he said gently, reaching out to take her hand. "If you'd like, I would be honored to be part of your family." Belle's face broke into a wide smile, and she launched herself into his arms, hugging him tightly. "I'm so glad," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she watched them, her heart filled with a joy she had thought she would never feel again. She knew, in that moment, that they had found a home together, that they were no longer bound by loss but by love. As they sat there, basking in the warmth of their newfound family, Arthur realized that he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. He no longer felt haunted by the past. Instead, he was filled with hope for the future. This home, once a symbol of his sorrow, was now a place of healing, of love, of family. In the quiet hours of the night, Arthur found himself sitting alone in the remembrance room. But tonight it felt different. The memories of Isabel that once haunted this space no longer filled him with grief. Instead, they brought a gentle, bittersweet comfort. He could look at her portrait and feel gratitude, a quiet love that had not faded, only transformed. He thought back to all the years he'd spent locked inside his own grief, convinced that solitude was his only option. He had built this mansion as a fortress, a place to protect himself from the pain of the outside world. Yet it was Evelyn and Belle, two strangers who had needed him as much as he needed them, who had transformed it into a true home. They had brought him back to life, given him the courage to embrace the world again. "Thank you, Isabel," he whispered, his voice a soft prayer. "Thank you for teaching me how to love, even now." He felt as though she were with him, her spirit present in the warmth that filled the room, in the laughter that echoed down the halls, and in the love he now shared with Evelyn and Belle. For the first time, he felt that his love for Isabel could exist alongside his love for Evelyn, a beautiful continuation rather than a painful ending. His heart was no longer torn between the past and the present. They had woven together seamlessly, creating a new sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. The following morning, Arthur joined Evelyn in the garden. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the flowers, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of lavender and roses, the same scents Isabel had loved, the ones that Evelyn had brought back into his life without even knowing. Evelyn looked up as he approached, her face bright with a happiness they now shared. He took her hand in his, a gesture that had become natural, comforting. "Evelyn, I've spent so long living in regret," he began, his voice low and steady. "I thought that by isolating myself, I was honoring Isabel's memory. But now I see that loving again doesn't take away from the love I had for her. It's part of it, a way to keep her alive in everything I do." Evelyn squeezed his hand, her gaze warm with understanding. "Arthur, love is meant to grow, to be shared. Isabel would want you to live fully, to embrace life as she did." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. "With you and Belle, I feel like I've been given a second chance. And I don't intend to waste it." They walked together through the garden, talking about the future, about the life they could build together. Belle joined them, running ahead to pick flowers and bringing them back to present with a beaming smile. Together, they wove the blossoms into crowns and bracelets, laughing as Belle insisted on adorning each of them. Arthur looked at Evelyn and Belle, his heart swelling with a profound sense of gratitude. In this moment, he realized he had been redeemed, not by forgetting his past but by accepting it, by finding a way to honor Isabel through the love he now held for Evelyn and her daughter. This was his chance at redemption, a way to finally lay his grief to rest and fill his life with purpose and connection. As the weeks turned into months, Arthur, Evelyn, and Belle grew closer, each day reinforcing the bond they had formed. They became a family, not by blood but by choice, united by shared loss and newfound love. They filled the mansion with laughter and warmth, turning it from a place of sorrow into one of hope and joy. One evening, Arthur watched from the doorway as Belle played on the floor of the sitting room, her laughter ringing out as she built towers from blocks. Evelyn sat beside her, adding pieces and laughing when Belle knocked them over. Arthur's heart swelled with pride and contentment, a happiness he had once thought impossible. Evelyn looked up, catching his gaze, and gave him a smile that conveyed everything they had been through together, the pain, the healing, the love that had grown between them. Arthur walked over, sitting beside them, and wrapped his arm around her, feeling the solid, comforting presence of the family they had built together. In that moment, Arthur knew he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. He no longer felt the shadow of Isabel's absence. Instead, he felt her spirit woven into the love he shared with Evelyn and Belle. Life, he realized, had a way of offering second chances, of leading people together when they needed each other most. As he held Evelyn close, Arthur looked to the future with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. They were a family, and together, they would create new memories, honoring those they had lost and embracing the joy of each day. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Arthur knew, without a doubt, that he had finally come home.